The last few chapters out of Exodus and the book of Numbers in particular, that's that 40 years of wandering in the wilderness in the book of Numbers. There were some difficult moments there, brothers and sisters. When you read through Numbers, you get the impression that it was a difficult time between Israel and God, but in fact it wasn't. The book of Numbers only covers a period of 2 years out of the whole 40 years that they spent in the wilderness. During most of that period of time, Israel was hot after God. Israel pursued God in the wilderness. There was a pillar of cloud that was there, and by day and a pillar of fire by night. God gave Israel a physical manifestation of His presence so that they would realize He was there with them, in the midst of them. And God dwelt in the tabernacle in the wilderness, and all of God's people lived in tents. They did not live in houses like we are living in today. And when God moved, they took down the camp and they followed God. They pursued Him in the wilderness. There would be times when the pillar of fire and the pillar of cloud would be stationary for several days or several months. And the people would camp around the tabernacle. And they would be there in the wilderness worshiping God and loving God and serving God. And then God's presence would move. The cloud would move. And they would quickly take down the tents, everybody. And they were so well organized that they could quickly go and follow after God. So the pillar would go, the pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud would start to move. And Israel as a nation, 1 million or so people, started to move and pursue God in the wilderness. Wow. Sometimes God would only stop for a night. The people would bed down, camp, set it all up again, set the tabernacle up, the whole deal. God's presence would dwell in the tabernacle. And then the next morning, God would decide to move down the road a little bit farther. And the nation would move again. He led them through the wilderness. It was like this for 40 years. And every day, they got up and they pursued after God. When God moved, they moved. It could be argued, brothers and sisters, that they had no choice. And in fact, that really was true. Well, we always have a choice, don't we? But they needed God. They needed Him. In the wilderness, brothers and sisters, it's not like the wilderness in Canada. In Canada, we call the wilderness everything north of Vaughan or Barrie. That's the wilderness. When you start getting into the wilderness here in Canada, there's lots of trees. There's lots of lakes. There's lots of rivers. You could hunt. You could fish. You could do lots of things. You could survive off the land if you were really forced to, if you knew how to. The First Nations people did it for many, many years, living up in the north and in the bushland. They survived off the land. The wilderness that we're talking about is a waste, howling wilderness. When you see it, it is some of the most rugged country on the face of the planet. Nothing grows there in the wilderness. Nothing. Brothers and sisters, it amazes me when I see it, how rugged it is. I've been there a couple of times and looked off into the land that they would have traveled and the way they would have come into the land of Israel. It was totally barren and mountainous and rugged. If you were to go out at night into that land, it wouldn't be long in the dark. You would fall, you would trip, you would stumble because it's so rough and rugged, rocky, barren. There's not a tree. There's not a bush. There's not a blade of grass. There's nothing. It's amazing to me that Moses had a burning bush. Must have been a rare sight to see a bush at all. That's how barren it is. And that nation survived for 40 years. There was no rivers to go and get water from, no lakes to draw water from. God gave them water out of the rock. Moses would go with a staff in his hand and he'd speak to the rock and he'd strike it and water start gushing out of a rock. Supernatural supply. It's a miracle. Every day they'd wake up in the morning, manna would come from heaven. Bread from heaven miraculously would show up on the ground. They'd go out and they'd gather it every single day. And on Saturday they would gather enough for 2 days because on the Sabbath day, or on Friday enough for 2 days because on the Sabbath day there'd be none. It was a day of rest. They were totally dependent upon God. For 40 years, their clothing never wore out. You were always in style, and your clothing never wore out. And you never had to go shopping at the Walmart. I don't know if that'd be boring or what, but nonetheless, that's the way it was. Their clothing never wore out. Their feet never swelled. That's amazing to me. When you consider the terrain that they walked on, their feet never swelled. And their bodies, brothers and sisters, were strong and they were healthy. Despite the fact that they were under God's punishment because they refused to go into the promised land. And they were forced, I suppose you might say, to pursue God. They were dependent on God. They needed God to survive. They would have not made it in the wilderness except that God took care of them. Nonetheless, that was the point. Do you know that? God brought them into the wilderness for the purpose of humbling them, to teach them that man does not live by bread alone, but to teach the people that man lives by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And in the wilderness, they learned how to be dependent on God. They learned how to trust God and how to depend on God every day. And God took care of them and provided for them. I have had those kind of experiences in my life. I could testify to it. When I went to Sturgeon Falls and started pastoring in Sturgeon Falls, the church could only afford to pay me $200 a week. I was 32 years of age, I believe, at the time, and I had a wife and 2 children. I had bills to pay. I had a car that had payments. And not only that, I was buying my very first house. I had no money in the bank, and I was buying my very first house. And brothers and sisters, I made an offer on the house with no money. And I got my mortgage supplied supernaturally. I went to a banker, and the banker was a Christian. And I told the banker my situation and my plan. I had this plan. He told me, Derek, that's illegal. You can't do that. Oh, my heart just sunk. All of a sudden, this banker started to cry. I'm not kidding. He just started to cry. The tears just started coming down out of his eyes, running down his cheeks. I was kind of surprised. He said to me, Derek, God just spoke to me and told me to lend you all the money you need to purchase your house out of my own personal money, my own personal funds. And he wrote me a check for my mortgage. And that's how I got my very first house. Lived in Sturgeon Falls. I paid only $38,500 for it. But I had no money. I had $0. It could have been $1 million. I had $0. Amen? And I got my first house, and now I had a mortgage. I was paying $400 a month, but the guy told me, if you have a problem paying the mortgage, give me a call. He knew what I was making, $200 a week. I remember making my budget and saying to God in my budget, God, I can make it. I only need another $200 and I can make it. But I needed every single week, God. Every single week. And I wasn't including things like groceries. I was just talking about bills. The car payment, the insurance on the car, the gas in the car, the mortgage payment. I was surprised how much it cost people to really live. I was in the military before that, sheltered by the government. And afterwards, I'm living in the economy, the real world that real people live in. I was shocked at how much it cost people to live. I was shocked. I had to pay taxes and insurance, and I had to pay this and that, and you name it. And the money was all gone. And yet, brothers and sisters, our family never lacked. Our cupboards were full all the time. We could never get those cupboards empty. We could never eat it fast enough. God always made sure our cupboards were full. God always provided for us, brothers and sisters. Our children never went without. I remember going into the ministry, my wife, her fear was that our children would suffer. Our children would go without. But our children never suffered, and our children never went without. Because God is able, brothers and sisters, to set a table in the wilderness. And that's what he did for his people in the wilderness. They were dependent on God, but that was the point. And that's why God took them through that stage of their relationship with God. And during that period of time, they pursued God. The cloud would move, they would tear down camp, and they would move. Do you know what, brothers and sisters? When they got into the land that flowed with milk and honey, they forgot God. But the problem was this: whether you're poor or whether you're wealthy, you still need God. See, man doesn't just live by bread alone. Man lives on every word that God has spoken. That is a fact, brothers and sisters. We need God. Amen? Our government needs God. Our politicians need God.